welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The spring rain fell softly upon Enderby Hall, veiling the great house in a mist that seemed appropriate to the solemnity of the occasion. Hercule Poirot, standing at the window of his bedroom, observed the mourners departing after the funeral of Richard Abernethy, late master of this considerable estate. "A fine man, they say, mon ami," remarked Poirot to Captain Hastings, who sat in an armchair, attempting to adjust his black tie in the mirror. Yet observe how quickly his family disperses, now that the ceremony is concluded. Hastings looked up from his struggle with the recalcitrant tie. Natural enough, surely. Funerals are grim affairs. People want to get home to their own firesides. Perhaps. Yet I detect in this household something that disturbs the atmosphere. Something not quite right. Poirot turned from the window, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly to one side, his magnificent moustaches perfectly groomed despite the solemnity of the day. "There is a tension here, Hastings. It hangs in the air like the scent of decay beneath fresh flowers." Hastings frowned, finally abandoning his tie and rising to join his friend at the window. The last of the motor cars was disappearing down the long gravel drive, its taillights blurred by the persistent drizzle. I suppose families are always a bit strained at funerals. Grief affects people differently. Grief? Ah, yes. But I think there is more than grief here, mon ami. There is fear, and where there is fear, there is often guilt. Poirot's green eyes were thoughtful as he gazed out at the magnificent grounds of Enderby Hall. Acres of carefully tended gardens now subdued by the grey. Whether Poirot had been invited to Enderby Hall not by the deceased, whom he had never met, but by Mr. Entwistle, the family solicitor, a cautious man of the old school, who had expressed certain vague misgivings about the family situation and hoped Poirot might attend the funeral and subsequent reading of the will as an observer. "Merely a precaution, Monsieur Poirot," Entwistle had said, wringing his hands in his London office a week ago. "The Abernethys are a complicated family. Richard was concerned about something in his last weeks. He spoke to me of certain irregularities. He asked me to be vigilant, and then so suddenly he died." "You suspect foul play?" Poirot had asked directly. Entwistle had hesitated. "I suspect nothing, but I am uneasy. Richard Abernethy was a shrewd man, not given to fancies. If he was concerned, there was reason for it. I would value your presence, your observation. Your fee, of course, will be generous." Now, as the last mourners departed, Poirot turned from the window. "Come, Hastings, let us go down. The reading of the will commences at 4 o'clock. That, I think, will prove most instructive." "You think there'll be trouble?" Hastings asked, finally managing to secure his tie. "I think, mon ami, that when there is money involved, considerable money, there is always the potential for trouble, and the Abernethy fortune, it is very considerable indeed." They descended the grand staircase together, Poirot's small, neat figure moving with characteristic precision, Hastings's taller form beside him. The house was a testament to generations of wealth and taste. Oil paintings in gilt frames lined the walls, oriental carpets muffled their footsteps, and through open doors they glimpsed rooms filled with furniture that spoke of comfort and elegance. A maid in black dress and white apron directed them to the drawing-room, where the family was beginning to assemble. The drawing-room of Enderby Hall was a magnificent apartment, all cream panels and gilt mirrors, furnished with the accumulated treasures of 3 generations. Long windows overlooked the rain-soaked gardens, and a fire burned cheerfully in the marble fireplace, a welcome defence against the dampness of the day. Assembled there were the surviving Abernethys and their various attachments, arranged as if for a group portrait, though the atmosphere was far from harmonious. Mr. Entwistle, a neat elderly man with silver spectacles perched on his thin nose, sat at a writing desk that had been moved to face the room. Before him lay a sheaf of legal documents, their edges perfectly aligned. He nodded to Poirot as they entered, a small gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps relief. Around him, disposed on sofas and chairs like pieces on a chessboard, sat the inheritors. Poirot's keen eyes took in each one, noting details that Hastings would have overlooked. There was George Crossfield, Richard's nephew, a prosperous-looking man in his 40s with a hearty manner and a red face that suggested either good living or high blood pressure, possibly both. His laugh was too loud, his handshake too firm, his expressions of grief too theatrical. He wore his morning suit as if it were a costume, something to be donned for the occasion and quickly discarded. Beside him perched his wife, Mary, a faded woman with anxious eyes, who kept glancing nervously at the others, as if expecting criticism or attack at any moment. In the window seat lounged Timothy Abernethy, Richard's younger brother, an invalid, or so he claimed, though his constitution appeared robust enough to Poirot's discerning eye. He was perhaps 65, with thinning hair and a perpetual expression of discomfort that seemed more habit than genuine suffering. His wife, Maud, sat protectively near him, a thin woman with an acid tongue and watchful eyes, dressed in black that emphasized her angular figure. She had the air of a guard dog protecting its master. Near the fireplace stood Susan Banks, Richard's niece, a striking woman in her 30s with auburn hair swept back from a high forehead and intelligent green eyes that missed little. She wore her mourning with a certain style, and there was about her an air of competence and determination. Her husband, Gregory, stood behind her chair, a serious young man with artistic pretensions, evident in his flowing tie, and the paint stains he had not quite managed to remove from his fingers. He had the slightly abstracted air of one whose thoughts were elsewhere, perhaps on some canvas or sculpture. Near them sat Helen Abernethy, widow of Richard's younger brother Leo, who had died some 15 years ago. She was perhaps 50, still handsome, with dark hair only lightly touched with grey, and a dignity in her bearing that spoke of breeding and character. She wore mourning well, as one who has had practice in grief. Her face was composed, but Poirot detected strain in the tightness around her mouth, the shadows beneath her eyes, and finally there was Cora Lansquenet, Richard's younger sister, a foolish, fluttering woman of 60-odd years who seemed almost a caricature of the eccentric artist. She wore a shapeless black dress that hung awkwardly on her thin frame, and her grey hair escaped in wisps from an unflattering hat. She had married an unsuccessful painter named Pierre Lansquenet, and lived in poverty in a cottage in Berkshire, largely forgotten by the more prosperous branches of the family. Her eyes, pale blue and rather vacant, moved restlessly from person to person, and she had the habit of speaking her thoughts aloud, regardless of propriety. Poirot and Hastings occupied chairs near the door, observers rather than participants. A clock on the mantelpiece chimed 4, its notes clear and melancholy. Mr. Entwistle cleared his throat. I thank you all for remaining after the funeral. I know this has been a difficult day, a sad day. Richard Abernethy was a man of substance, of character. He will be missed. He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "I shall now read the last will and testament of Richard Abernethy, deceased, dated the 15th of March, this year." There was a small stir in the room. George Crossfield leaned forward. "March the 15th? But that's only 2 weeks ago." "Indeed," said Mr. Entwistle quietly. "Mr. Abernethy made several changes to his will in his final weeks. This is the most recent version." "What was wrong with the old will?" demanded Timothy querulously. "Why all these changes?" "That, I fear, Mr. Abernethy did not confide to me. He said only that he wished to set certain matters straight." Entwistle looked down at the document before him. "Shall I proceed?" Murmurs of assent. Poirot watched each face carefully, noting the greed, the anxiety, the calculation that flickered across features momentarily unguarded. Entwistle began to read in his dry, precise voice. The will was straightforward enough in its structure, if not in its implications. The estate, valued at approximately $700,000, a considerable fortune in 1953, was to be divided among Richard's surviving relatives. To his brother Timothy, $100,000 and certain personal effects. To his sister Cora, $100,000 despite her long estrangement from the family. To his nephew George Crossfield, $150,000 and various shares in the family businesses. To his niece, Susan Banks, $150,000 and the contents of the London house. To Helen Abernethy, widow of his late brother Leo, $50,000 and a life interest in certain trust funds. Enderby Hall itself, with its furnishings and grounds, was to be sold. The proceeds divided equally among all beneficiaries. There were smaller bequests to servants, to charities, to old friends. But the bulk of the fortune was distributed as Entwistle had outlined. When he finished, there was silence. Then Timothy spoke, his voice slightly tremulous. "Very fair, I must say. Richard always was fair-minded, even if we didn't always see eye to eye." "Generous to you, Cora," said Maud Abernethy, with an edge to her voice. "Considering you hadn't seen Richard in 20 years. Cora blinked. "Oh, but I had seen him. I visited him just 3 weeks ago." "Didn't you know?" "No," said George Crossfield slowly. "We didn't know." "What was the occasion?" "No occasion. I simply wanted to see him. We had a nice long chat. He seemed very well, though troubled about something. I did wonder." "Wondered what?" Susan Banks's voice was sharp. "Well, it does seem odd, doesn't it?" "What seems odd?" Mr. Entwistle asked, though something in his tone suggested he feared the answer. Cora Lansquenet looked around the room with her vague, rather foolish smile. "Why," she said brightly, "that he was murdered, of course." The effect of Cora's words was electric. For a moment the room seemed frozen, as if a photographer had captured them all in a flashbulb's glare. Then chaos erupted. George Crossfield rose to his feet, his face darkening. "Good God, Cora, what are you saying? That's a monstrous suggestion." Timothy suffered what appeared to be a violent coughing fit, his face reddening as Maud thumped him on the back with more vigour than sympathy. Susan Banks stared at her aunt with an expression of mingled horror and fascination, while Gregory's artistic abstraction vanished, replaced by sharp attention. Helen Abernethy's hand went to her throat, her composure slipping for the first time. "Cora, please. You must not say such things." "Mrs. Lansquenet," said Mr. Entwistle severely, half rising from his seat, "I must ask you not to make such wild statements. There is absolutely no evidence to support such a claim. Your brother died peacefully in his sleep. Dr. Barstow certified death by natural causes. Heart failure, which was entirely consistent with Mr. Abernethy's medical history. But there must be evidence," Cora insisted with the stubborn conviction of the foolish. "Why else would he have changed his will only 2 weeks ago? He must have known he was in danger." The will was changed for reasons of Richard's own, Entwistle said firmly. It had nothing to do with... But it had everything to do with it. Cora interrupted, her thin voice rising. Don't you see? He discovered something. Something about the family that shocked him terribly. He told me so himself when I visited. He said, Cora, I've been blind for years. But now I see clearly, and I must set things right. Those were his exact words. The silence that followed was profound. Poirot leaned forward slightly in his chair, his green eyes intent. Did he tell you, Poirot asked quietly, what it was that he had discovered? All eyes turned to the little Belgian detective in the corner. Several faces showed surprise. They had forgotten his presence. Who the devil are you? Demanded George Crossfield, his bluster returning. Mr. Entwistle intervened hastily. This is Monsieur Hercule Poirot, the distinguished private detective. I took the liberty of inviting him to observe today's proceedings. Why? Susan Banks's voice was sharp with suspicion. What made you think you needed a detective at a simple will reading? Entwistle shifted uncomfortably. I am executor of the estate. I have a duty to ensure everything is in order. And I confess, I was uneasy. Richard's death, though certified as natural, came very suddenly. He had been in good spirits, making plans for the future. And then, overnight, he was gone. Old men die, Timothy said. His coughing fit subsided. It's the natural order of things. No mystery about it. Perhaps not, Poirot said softly. But let us return to my question. Mrs. Lansquenet, did your brother tell you what he had discovered? Cora frowned, her thin face creasing with concentration. Not exactly. He wouldn't tell me the details. He said he needed to verify certain facts, to be absolutely certain before he spoke. He said it concerned someone's... What was the word? Oh yes, their legitimacy. He said someone in the family wasn't who they appeared to be. The room erupted again in protests and denials. Poirot raised one hand, and something in his manner commanded attention. The voices subsided. Mesdames et messieurs, please, let us proceed logically. We have heard a serious accusation. We must examine it seriously. Mrs. Lansquenet, when did this conversation with your brother take place? 3 weeks ago. I came down on the train. Such an expensive journey. But Richard had sent me the fare. He wanted to see me particularly. We had tea together in his study. And he was alone when you visited? No one else was present? Helen was in the house, of course. She'd been staying here for several weeks, helping Richard sort through his late wife's possessions. But during our conversation, Richard and I were alone. Poirot turned to Helen. Madam, you were here. Did you know of this visit? Helen nodded slowly. Yes, Richard told me Cora was coming. He asked me to make myself scarce. He wanted privacy for their conversation. I thought nothing of it at the time. They were brother and sister. It was natural they should want to speak privately. And did Richard seem troubled after this conversation? He seemed... Helen paused, choosing her words carefully. He seemed determined. Yes, that's the word. As if he had made a difficult decision and was resolved to carry it through. What decision? Gregory Banks demanded. I don't know. He wouldn't tell me. But he spent the next 2 weeks closeted in his study, going through old papers, old documents. He barely came out except for meals. Did anyone else visit him during this time? Poirot asked. George Crossfield cleared his throat. I came down twice. Business matters. I managed some of Richard's investments. We needed his signature on certain documents. And these visits, they were scheduled. The first was. The second, George hesitated. The second was rather unexpected. I had a question about one of the accounts. I drove down without telephoning first. When was this? 3 days before his death. And his manner. How did he seem? Distracted. Preoccupied, not his usual self at all. We had words, actually. He accused me of, well, of certain irregularities in my accounting. Quite unfounded accusations, were they? Poirot asked mildly. George's face reddened. Certainly they were. I've managed Richard's investments for 15 years without a single complaint. Until now, Susan observed. Susan, her mother Helen said sharply. Well, it's true, isn't it? Uncle Richard questioned George's accounting. He changed his will. He spoke of someone not being who they appeared to be. And then he died, very conveniently, before he could reveal whatever he'd discovered. Susan's green eyes were hard as she looked around the room. I think Aunt Cora is right. I think Uncle Richard was murdered. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Faces that had been composed now showed strain, calculation, fear. Poirot rose from his chair and walked slowly to the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. If we are to pursue this matter, he said quietly, we must be methodical. We must establish facts. First, the circumstances of Mr. Abernethy's death. Mr. Entwistle, you will please tell us exactly what occurred. Entwistle looked unhappy but complied. Richard retired to bed on the evening of March 25th, complaining of indigestion. This was not unusual. He often suffered from dyspepsia. Helen gave him some bicarbonate of soda, and he went to his room. In the morning, the maid went to take him his tea and found him dead. He appeared to have died peacefully in his sleep. Dr. Barstow was called immediately. And Dr. Barstow's diagnosis? Heart failure. Richard had a weak heart. He'd been treated for it for several years. Dr. Barstow saw nothing suspicious. He signed the death certificate without hesitation. Was there an autopsy? No, there seemed no reason for one. Poirot nodded slowly. I see. And now, if you please, I would like to know where each of you was on the night of March 25th. The protests came immediately. George Crossfield blustered that this was outrageous. Timothy claimed his health could not stand such interrogation. But Poirot's calm insistence, backed by Mr. Entwistle's authority as executor, eventually prevailed. George and Mary Crossfield had been in London, at their house in Chelsea. We were entertaining friends, George said. A dinner party. 6 guests, all of whom can verify our presence. The guests' names? Poirot produced a small notebook. George provided them, though with obvious reluctance. Timothy and Maud had been at their house in Bournemouth. I was confined to bed with one of my attacks, Timothy said. Maud was attending to me. Our servants can confirm it, the servants' names. Maud provided them, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. Susan and Gregory Banks had been in their cottage in the village of Enderby, only 3 miles from the Hall. We retired early, Susan said. Gregory had been working all day and was exhausted. We were both asleep by 10 o'clock. You can verify each other's presence then? Yes, Susan said, but something in her tone was uncertain. Gregory spoke for the first time in several minutes. Actually, I was working in my studio. It's a separate building behind the cottage. I often work late into the night. I didn't come to bed until nearly 2 in the morning. Susan's head turned sharply. You didn't tell me that. You were asleep. I didn't want to disturb you. Poirot made a note. So you, Mr. Banks, have no alibi for the night in question. I was in my studio, Gregory protested. Alone, unverified. You could have been anywhere. Poirot turned to Cora. And you, Madame Lansquenet? I was at home in my cottage in Berkshire. Quite alone, I'm afraid. I live by myself, you see. Just me and my cats. No one can verify your presence. Well, the milkman comes at 7 in the morning. He saw me then, but not during the evening or night. No. Cora seemed untroubled by this, but I wouldn't have hurt Richard. He was my brother, and he had just changed his will in your favor, leaving you $100,000. Poirot observed. A considerable sum for a woman living in poverty. I hadn't expected anything. I told you, Richard and I hadn't been close for years. The money was a complete surprise. Poirot turned lastly to Helen. And you, madam, you were here in the house? Yes. Helen's voice was low. I was in my room, directly across the hall from Richard's. I heard nothing unusual during the night. In the morning, I was awakened by the maid's scream when she found him. You gave him bicarbonate of soda for his indigestion. Yes, he kept it in his bathroom cupboard. I mixed it for him and took it to his room. Did you remain while he drank it? No, he said he would drink it and go straight to sleep. I wished him good night and returned to my room. And you heard nothing in the night? No sound from his room? Nothing, but Richard's door was heavy. Oak, you know, from the original house. And I am a sound sleeper. Poirot walked back to the window, gazing out at the rain-drenched gardens. There is a curious pattern here, he said thoughtfully. Mr. Abernethy discovers a secret. He changes his will. He dies suddenly, peacefully, with no signs of violence. And now his sister, who spoke of murder, suggests there was indeed foul play. He turned back to face the room. But if it was murder, how was it accomplished? There is no evidence of poison, no sign of violence. Dr. Barstow is a competent physician. He would have noticed something amiss. Unless, Susan said slowly, unless the poison mimicked natural death. I've read about such things. Certain poisons can cause heart failure that looks entirely natural. You have read extensively on poisons, madam. Poirot's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. I read detective novels, Susan said defensively. Is that a crime? No, but it is interesting. Tell me, does your husband's studio contain any unusual chemicals? For his art? Gregory shifted uncomfortably. Some oils, solvents, pigments. Some of them can be toxic if mishandled. Fascinating, Poirot murmured. Now see here, George exploded. You can't seriously be suggesting that one of us murdered Richard. We're his family. Precisely, monsieur. And it is often within families that the greatest crimes occur. For who benefits from Richard Abernethy's death? His family. Who had opportunity? Those who visited him. Those who lived nearby. Those who were in the house. Poirot's gaze swept the room. And who had motive? Ah, that is the most interesting question. For the motive, it lies in the secret that Richard discovered. The secret that concerned someone's legitimacy. What does that mean? Mary Crossfield spoke for the first time, her timid voice barely audible. It means, Poirot said gently, that someone in this room may not be who they claim to be, and that someone stood to lose everything if Richard revealed the truth. The gathering broke up in disorder after that, with angry protests and recriminations flying. George Crossfield threatened to sue for slander. Timothy claimed the stress would bring on another of his attacks. Only Helen maintained her composure, though her face was pale. As the family members dispersed to their rooms or prepared to depart, Poirot drew Cora Lansquenet aside. Madame, he said urgently, you have made a very dangerous statement today. You have announced to the world, or at least to this family, that you believe your brother was murdered. If there is indeed a murderer present, you have made yourself a target. Cora laughed, a thin, rather silly sound. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, I'm not frightened. Who would want to harm me? I'm just a silly old woman with no money and no importance. You are a woman with $100,000 coming to her. And more importantly, you are a woman who might remember something dangerous. Your brother confided in you. Perhaps he told you more than you realize. Perhaps there is some detail, some small thing that would identify the person he suspected. But he didn't tell me anything specific. Just what I said about someone not being legitimate. Nevertheless, I urge you to be careful. When do you return to your cottage? Tomorrow morning. I'm catching the 9 o'clock train. I do want to get back to my cats. They'll be wondering where I am. You live alone? Yes, well, I have a woman who comes in 3 times a week to clean, Mrs. Gooding. But otherwise, I'm quite solitary. I prefer it that way, more time for my painting. You paint? Poirot's interest sharpened. Oh yes. Not very well, I'm afraid. Pierre, my late husband, he was the talented one. But I enjoy it. I was actually painting a picture of Enderby Hall during my visit. Richard let me set up my easel in the garden. Such a lovely house. I wanted to capture it before it sold. You have this painting? At home, yes. I took it back with me to finish. I should very much like to see it. Perhaps I could visit you in a day or two. Oh, that would be lovely. I so rarely have visitors. Yes, do come, Monsieur Poirot. I'm in Berkshire, in the village of Gorse Bottom. Ivy Cottage, everyone knows it. I shall come, Poirot promised. But please, madame, until then, be very careful. Lock your doors. Trust no one. And if you remember anything at all, about your conversation with your brother, telephone me immediately. He produced his card. This is my London number. Cora took the card, glancing at it vaguely before tucking it into her handbag. You're very kind, Monsieur Poirot, but I'm sure I'll be perfectly safe. After all, if someone did murder Richard, though I can't imagine who, they've got what they wanted. The will has been read. There's no reason to harm anyone else. On the contrary, madam, if you know something dangerous, there is every reason. Poirot's face was grave. The first murder, it is difficult, but the second, it becomes easier, and the third easier still. Please, remember what I have said. But Cora only laughed again, and said she would be perfectly fine, thank you, and hurried off to pack her bags. Hastings joined Poirot in the hallway. Do you really think she's in danger? I fear so, mon ami. She is foolish, indiscreet, and she has announced that she believes her brother was murdered. If there is a killer in this family, Mrs. Lansquenet has painted a target on her back. Poirot shook his head. I have warned her, but the foolish, they never listen. We can only hope that her danger is not immediate. That evening, Poirot insisted on interviewing each family member privately. He set up in the library, a comfortable room lined with books, and received them one by one. George Crossfield came first, still blustering. This is all nonsense, Monsieur Poirot. Cora's a fool, always has been, given to flights of fancy. Richard died of natural causes, and that's the end of it. Perhaps. But humour me, monsieur. Tell me about your relationship with your uncle. George's confidence slipped slightly. We got along well enough. I managed his investments, as I said. He trusted me with substantial sums, until recently. That was a misunderstanding. A temporary confusion in the accounts. These things happen. What sort of confusion? Just figures that didn't quite match up. I had explanations for all of it. Richard was being unreasonable. And yet he questioned you, accused you of irregularities. This was 3 days before his death. Yes, and I was furious. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're suggesting. Did your uncle threaten to remove you as his investment manager? George hesitated. He mentioned the possibility, said he needed to think things over, which would have cost you your fees. Substantial fees, I imagine, for managing such a large fortune. I didn't care about the fees, but George's face said otherwise. Poirot dismissed him and called in Timothy and Maud. Timothy leaned heavily on his cane, his face drawn with apparent suffering. This is all too much for my constitution, he complained. I'm not a well man, Monsieur Poirot. My heart, my digestion, I suffer terribly. Yet you benefit handsomely from your brother's death. £100,000. I would rather have my brother alive. Timothy said with surprising force. "Richard and I had our differences, but he was my brother. We grew up together. We built the family business together. Before I was forced to retire due to ill health." "When did this retirement occur?" 20 years ago, Maud interjected. "Timothy had a nervous collapse. He's been an invalid ever since." "How unfortunate! And you, madame, you have nursed him all this time." "I have done my duty as a wife." "A difficult duty, no doubt, and expensive. An invalid requires constant care, medications, doctors." "We've managed," Maud said tightly. "But you've been short of money. Richard helped you, did he not?" "He gave us an allowance," Timothy admitted, "as was proper. I gave him my best years in the business. I deserve to be taken care of. And now, with your inheritance, you will be independent." "Yes," Timothy said. Finally, after they left, Susan and Gregory entered. Susan was composed, but Gregory seemed agitated. "Mrs. Banks," Poirot said, "you were quite convinced that your uncle was murdered. Why? Because it makes sense. Uncle Richard discovers something shocking. He changes his will. Days later, he's dead. The timing is too convenient. You are a logical woman." "I try to be. I worked as a nurse during the war. I learned to observe, to note symptoms, to question convenient diagnoses." "Ah, a nurse! Then you would know about poisons, about drugs." "I would know something, yes. Enough to know that certain substances can mimic natural death if administered cleverly. Such as digitalis, for one. In the correct dose, it can cause heart failure that appears entirely natural, especially in someone with a weak heart. Where would one obtain digitalis? It's derived from foxglove, which grows wild in many gardens, or one could extract it from digitalis tablets prescribed for heart conditions." "Did your uncle take such medication?" "I believe he did. Dr. Barstow had prescribed it for him." Poirot turned to Gregory. "And you, monsieur, you work late in your studio. You have access to chemicals, solvents. You were awake on the night your uncle died, with no one to verify your whereabouts." Gregory flushed. "I was working. I'm preparing for an exhibition. I needed every hour I could spare." "What sort of art do you create?" "Sculptures, mainly. Some experimental work with resins and chemical treatments." "Involving toxic substances. Some of them can be dangerous if mishandled. But I'm careful." "Were you aware of your uncle's suspicions about the family?" "Not until after he died. He never confided in me. We weren't close." "Yet you live very near Enderby Hall. You could easily have visited that night." "I didn't. I was in my studio working. Susan will tell you I often work through the night." Susan's face was troubled. "He does, but I can't swear he was there that particular night. I was asleep." Finally, Helen Abernethy entered, her dignity unshaken despite the day's events. "Madam," Poirot said gently, "you were closest to Richard in his final weeks. Did he truly confide nothing to you?" Helen was silent for a long moment. Then she said quietly, He said he had been blind, that he had accepted something at face value that was a lie. He said it concerned the family, someone's heritage, their right to be considered part of the Abernethy line." "Did he say who?" "No. He said he needed to be absolutely certain before he made such a serious accusation. He said he was gathering evidence, documents. He spent hours in the old family papers, going back decades." "Where are these papers now?" "I don't know. After his death, I noticed his study had been disturbed. Papers were scattered, drawers open. I assumed it was Mr. Entwistle searching for the will. But it was not. Mr. Entwistle had the will already." Poirot leaned forward. "Someone searched that study, madame. Someone was looking for the evidence Richard had gathered, and I think they found it." Helen's composure cracked slightly. "You truly believe he was murdered?" I believe it is possible, and if so, the murderer is very clever, very bold, and very dangerous. The telegram arrived at Poirot's London apartment 3 days later, delivered by a breathless boy who had been instructed to wait for a reply. Hastings opened it while Poirot was finishing his breakfast. A perfectly prepared boiled egg, toast soldiers, and hot chocolate. His friend's face paled as he read the terse message. "Poirot," he said, his voice shaking. "It's from Mr. Entwistle. Cora Lansquenet has been murdered." The egg spoon clattered onto the plate. Poirot was on his feet in an instant, his face grave. "When? How?" Hastings read the telegram aloud. "Cora Lansquenet murdered. Stop cottage ransacked. Stop, please come immediately. Stop and whistle. Sacré bleu." Poirot's hand clenched into a fist. "I warned her. I told her she was in danger." But she would not listen, the foolish woman. She laughed. She said she was safe. His voice was anguished. "And now she is dead, and it is my fault. I should have insisted. I should have placed a guard. Poirot, you couldn't have known." "But I did know. I knew she was in danger, and I let her go to her death. Quickly, Hastings, we must go to Berkshire at once. Pack a bag. We may need to stay several days." Within an hour, they were on a train speeding west through the green English countryside. Poirot sat in their compartment, his face set in grim lines, his fingers drumming restlessly on the armrest. "She remembered something," he said abruptly, "or the murderer feared she might. That is why she had to die. But what was it? What did she know? Perhaps she contacted the killer," Hastings suggested. "Told them her suspicions, possible. Or perhaps she spoke to someone else, someone who carried the tale. Or perhaps—" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps the painting. She said she was painting Enderby Hall. She saw something she captured on canvas without realizing its significance. And the killer knew it. They arrived in Gorse Bottom in the early afternoon. The village was a pretty place, all thatched cottages and flowering gardens, though the tragedy that had occurred cast a pall over its tranquillity. Ivy Cottage sat at the end of a lane, a small shabby building with peeling paint and an overgrown garden. Mr. Entwistle met them at the gate, his face drawn with shock and grief. "Thank God you've come, Monsieur Poirot. This is terrible, terrible. Poor Cora, to die like that." "Tell me everything," Poirot commanded. They walked up the path together. Inside the cottage, Entwistle had been joined by Inspector Raglan of the local police, a stolid man with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Monsieur Poirot," Raglan said, shaking hands, "Mr. Entwistle has told me about you. I'm glad to have your assistance. This is a brutal business. How did she die?" "Struck on the head with a hatchet. Multiple blows. Death would have been instantaneous, the doctor says. Happened sometime yesterday afternoon, we believe." "Who found her?" "Mrs. Gooding, the cleaning woman. She comes in 3 times a week. She arrived this morning at 9 o'clock and found Mrs. Lansquenet in her studio, an old outhouse she'd converted for painting." "The body has been removed?" "Yes, about an hour ago, but I've left the scene otherwise untouched, knowing you were coming." Poirot walked through the cottage slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The main room was small and cluttered, filled with shabby furniture, stacks of books, and amateur paintings in various stages of completion. 3 cats watched suspiciously from various perches. "The cottage was ransacked," Raglan explained. "Every drawer pulled out, papers scattered everywhere. Someone was looking for something." "Or wished to give that impression," Poirot murmured. He moved to the studio, a small converted building at the back of the garden. Here was Cora's workspace, an easel, paints, canvases stacked against the walls, and here, on the floor, was the dark stain where she had fallen. Poirot studied the scene intently. The easel held an unfinished painting of Enderby Hall, just as Cora had described. The house was captured in her primitive but oddly charming style. The proportions not quite right, the perspective slightly off. "The weapon?" Poirot asked. "Hatchet from her own woodshed. No fingerprints wiped clean. And the time of death? Between 1 and 4 yesterday afternoon, the doctor estimates." "Who knew she would be here?" "Everyone who attended the funeral," Entwistle said quietly. "She announced she was returning home the next morning." Poirot knelt beside the painting, examining it closely. "Hastings, bring me that magnifying glass from my case." For several minutes he studied the canvas in silence. Then he straightened, his face thoughtful. "There is something here," he said slowly. "Something that Cora saw, something she painted. But what?" He turned to examine the rest of the studio. On a small table beside the easel, he found Cora's sketchbook, filled with preliminary studies of Enderby Hall. And there, tucked between 2 pages, was a half-written letter. "Voila," Poirot breathed, carefully extracting it. The letter was in Cora's handwriting. "Dated 2 days ago, dear Mr. Entwistle. I have been thinking about what I said at the funeral. I'm afraid I spoke rather hastily and without thinking. But now that I've had time to reflect, I'm more convinced than ever that dear Richard was murdered. You see, he told me something else during my visit. Something I forgot to mention at the funeral, because it didn't seem important at the time. But now I realize the letter ended there unfinished. She remembered something," Poirot said grimly. "Something crucial. And before she could tell anyone, she was silenced. But what did she remember?" Hastings asked. "That, mon ami, is the question. But I think—" Poirot returned to the painting, studying it intently. "I think perhaps the answer is here in this painting. Something she saw at Enderby Hall. Something she captured without realizing its significance." He turned to Inspector Raglan. "I would like to take this painting and the letter. They are evidence, of course. Anything to catch this monster. The alibis of the family members must be checked. All of them. Where was each person yesterday afternoon?" "I've already sent telegrams," Entwistle said. "I thought you would want to know." "Bon. And now I must examine the cottage more thoroughly. There may be other clues." For the next 2 hours, Poirot searched Ivy Cottage with meticulous care. In the chaos of scattered papers, he found old letters, bills, receipts. The detritus of a life lived in genteel poverty, but nothing that seemed immediately relevant to the case. Until, in the pocket of a coat hanging by the door, he found a small pressed flower. It was dried and fragile, but still recognizable. A sprig of rosemary. "Rosemary," he murmured, holding it up to the light. "For remembrance. How very appropriate. What's significant about rosemary?" Hastings asked. "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. It is a detail, Hastings, and in details we find the truth." He carefully wrapped the flower in his handkerchief. "We must return to London. I must think. And I must study this painting most carefully." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Gooding arrived, a stout, red-faced woman who had clearly been crying. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she sobbed. "Poor Mrs. Lansquenet. She was a kind lady for all her odd ways. Who would do such a terrible thing? That is what I intend to discover, madam. Tell me, did you notice any visitors to the cottage in recent days?" Mrs. Gooding thought. "Well, there was a person yesterday morning. I saw them walking up the lane as I was leaving, but I didn't see their face. They had their coat collar turned up and a hat pulled low. Man or woman? I couldn't say for certain. Medium height, medium build. Could have been either. What time was this?" "About noon. I'd just finished the morning's work." "And you saw no one else?" "No, sir. The lane doesn't get much traffic. Ivy Cottage is quite isolated." Poirot thanked her, and they returned to London, carrying the painting and the unfinished letter. Back in his London apartment, Poirot set up the painting on a stand and sat before it, his chin resting on his steepled fingers, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Hastings paced restlessly. "I don't see how a painting can tell us who the murderer is, Poirot." "Ah, but it can, Hastings, if we only have the eyes to see. Cora Lansquenet was a poor painter, but she was an honest one. She painted what she saw, and she saw something at Enderby Hall that was significant. Something that, when combined with what her brother told her, would identify the murderer." "But what? It just looks like a house to me, précisément. It looks like a house, but is it an accurate representation? Count the windows, Hastings." Hastings peered at the painting. "Well, there's the drawing room, 2 large windows, and above that the bedrooms, 3 windows on the 2nd floor, and above that the attics—" "Stop! You said 3 windows on the 2nd floor." "Yes. Count them again, carefully." Hastings counted. "Drawing room, 2 windows. 2nd floor, 3 windows. Wait. No. There are 4 windows on the 2nd floor in the painting." "Exactly! An extra window. A window that does not exist in the actual house. Why would Cora paint a window that is not there? Perhaps she made a mistake. Cora's paintings, they are primitive, yes, but they are accurate. She paints what she sees, not what she imagines. If she painted 4 windows, it is because she saw 4 windows. But that's impossible. Or," Poirot leaned forward intently, "or there is a window that is hidden from normal view, a window to a room that is concealed. A secret room, Hastings. Good Lord! You mean there's a hidden room at Enderby Hall?" "I mean exactly that, and I believe that in that room, Richard Abernethy found the evidence he was seeking. The evidence of someone's illegitimacy. The evidence that got him killed." Hastings sat down heavily. "But a secret room. Surely someone would know about it. Perhaps, perhaps not. Old houses, they have many secrets. Priest holes, hidden passages, concealed chambers. If the room was sealed up long ago, even the family might have forgotten its existence. How do we find it? We return to Enderby Hall tomorrow, and we search until we find this room and its secrets." Poirot's eyes glinted. "But tonight, I must think. There is something here, something that connects all the pieces. The window, the rosemary, the letter, Richard's discovery of illegitimacy." He spent the evening pacing his apartment, muttering to himself in French, occasionally pausing to jot notes in his precise handwriting. Hastings knew better than to disturb him when he was in this state. Finally, near midnight, Poirot stopped pacing. "Hastings," he said slowly, "I begin to see. Not clearly yet, but the outline is forming. There is a pattern here, a pattern of deception that goes back many years. But I need more evidence. Tomorrow, we find that hidden room." The next morning found them once again at Enderby Hall. Mr. Entwistle had arranged for them to have complete access to the house, which stood empty now, its furnishings shrouded in dust covers, awaiting sale. Poirot went immediately to the 2nd floor, carrying Cora's painting. He positioned himself in the garden where she must have stood while painting, comparing the canvas to the actual house. "There," he said, pointing, "between Helen's bedroom and what was Richard's study. That is where the 4th window should be. But from outside, there is only blank wall." They entered the house and climbed to the 2nd floor. The corridor was long and panelled in dark oak. Helen's bedroom was on the right, Richard's study on the left. Poirot measured the space carefully, tapping on walls, examining the panelling. "The wall between these rooms is too thick, Hastings. Much too thick for a simple partition. There is space here, space for a small room. How do we get in? These old houses, they have mechanisms. Springs, hidden latches. We must examine every inch of this panelling. For an hour they searched, pressing, tapping, sliding their hands along the ornate woodwork. It was Hastings who finally found it. A carved rosette that, when pressed and turned simultaneously, released a hidden catch. A section of panelling swung inward, revealing a narrow doorway and a small chamber beyond. Voila! Poirot breathed, his eyes bright with triumph. The room was small, barely 8 feet square, with a single narrow window that overlooked the garden. The window Cora had painted. It was dusty and cobwebbed, clearly unused for many years, but it was not empty. Against one wall stood a small writing desk, and in the desk's drawer, carefully preserved in a leather folder, were documents, letters, certificates, photographs. Poirot spread them out carefully on the desk's surface, his hands trembling slightly with excitement. There were letters dating back 25 years, written in a woman's graceful hand. Love letters, passionate and indiscreet, and they were addressed to Leo Abernethy, Richard's younger brother, Helen's late husband. But they were not written by Helen. The signature at the bottom of each letter was Evelyn. Who is Evelyn? Hastings asked, bewildered. Poirot was reading rapidly, his face intent. Evelyn Garth, a woman Leo Abernethy had a relationship with before his marriage to Helen. And look, Hastings, here is a birth certificate. A child born to Evelyn Garth in 1928, father listed as Leo Abernethy. Good God! Leo had an illegitimate child, so it appears. And this child, Poirot shuffled through the documents. This child was given up for adoption. Here is the adoption certificate, dated 1928. The child went to... He read the names carefully. To a Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Banks. Banks! Hastings exclaimed. But that's... Gregory Banks's parents, yes. Or so one would assume. Poirot's eyes gleamed. But is it Gregory who is the illegitimate child? Or is there another possibility? He continued to examine the documents. There were photographs too. Old, faded images of a young woman with dark hair and striking features. And a photograph of a baby. This is the secret, Poirot said softly. This is what Richard discovered. Someone in the family is not who they claim to be. Someone is illegitimate, has no legal right to the Abernethy name or fortune. But who? Gregory? Perhaps. Or perhaps. Poirot picked up one of the letters, reading it carefully. Listen to this, Hastings. My darling Leo, I know you must marry Helen. Your family insists upon it, and she will bring you the connections you need. But know that you are mine, you have always been mine. And our child, wherever she is, carries our love. Our child, she says. Not he, a daughter, Hastings, not a son. Then it's not Gregory. I do not think so. Gregory was born in 1920, I believe. This child was born in 1928. No, there is another answer here. Poirot tapped his forehead. The little grey cells, they are working, mon ami. They see a pattern. But I need one more piece of evidence. One more confirmation. He gathered the documents carefully. We must return to London. I must make certain inquiries. About adoption records, about birth certificates. And I must interview the family again. This time with these documents to guide me. Over the next 2 days, Poirot worked with furious intensity. He sent telegrams, made telephone calls, consulted with Mr. Entwistle about family histories and genealogies. He disappeared into Somerset House to examine records. He hired a private investigator to trace adoption records from 1928. Hastings watched his friend with growing admiration and some bewilderment. Poirot seemed to be constructing an elaborate edifice of facts, each piece carefully chosen and fitted into place. Finally, on the third day, Poirot announced himself satisfied. "I have it all now, Hastings. The complete picture. I know who killed Richard Abernethy and Cora Lansquenet. I know the motive, the method, and the means. And tonight, we will have our denouement. You're going to confront the killer. I am going to gather the family and present them with the truth. Mr. Entwistle has arranged for them all to meet at his office at 8 o'clock this evening. They believe it is to discuss the estate, the sale of Enderby Hall. They do not know that they are coming to witness the unmasking of a double murderer." "Poirot, is that wise? The killer has already murdered twice. If they feel cornered, Inspector Raglan and several police officers will be present, concealed in an adjoining room. The killer will not escape. But it is important that the truth be revealed before witnesses, that justice be seen to be done." That evening, they arrived at Mr. Entwistle's office in Lincoln's Inn. A sombre building with dark panelling and an air of Victorian respectability. The family was already gathered in Entwistle's conference room. Seated around a long mahogany table, all were present. George and Mary Crossfield, Timothy and Maud Abernethy, Susan and Gregory Banks, and Helen Abernethy. Their faces showed various degrees of nervousness, irritation, and curiosity. Poirot entered and took his place at the head of the table, Hastings beside him. Mr. Entwistle sat nearby, his face grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice calm and measured, "I have asked you here tonight because it is time for the truth to be revealed. The truth about the deaths of Richard Abernethy and Cora Lansquenet. The truth about a secret that has been hidden for 25 years. The truth about murder." The room was silent. Every eye was fixed on Poirot's face. "Let us begin," Poirot said, "with Richard Abernethy. He was a shrewd man, a careful man. He noticed things, even small things, and about a month before his death, he noticed something that troubled him deeply." He paused, his eyes moving from face to face. What he noticed was a resemblance, a facial feature perhaps, a mannerism, something that made him look more closely at one member of his family. And when he looked, other things began to fall into place. Small discrepancies, dates that didn't quite match, a past that didn't quite align with the official story. "Get to the point, Monsieur Poirot," George Crossfield said impatiently. "The point, monsieur, is that Richard began to investigate. He went through old family papers, old records, and he found what he was looking for. A hidden room at Enderby Hall. A room that contained documents his brother Leo had concealed many years ago. Documents that proved Leo had fathered an illegitimate child before his marriage to Helen." Helen's face went white. "That's not true. Leo never—" "I am afraid it is true, madam. The evidence is irrefutable. Letters, birth certificates, adoption records, all hidden away in that secret room. Leo had a relationship with a woman named Evelyn Garth. In 1888, Evelyn gave birth to a daughter. Leo could not acknowledge the child. He was engaged to you, madame, and his family would never have countenanced a marriage to Evelyn. So the child was given up for adoption." "But what does this have to do with the murders?" Susan Banks demanded. "Everything, madam. Because you see, that illegitimate daughter grew up, discovered her true parentage, and found her way into the Abernethy family. She presented herself as someone else, someone with a legitimate claim to the family name. And for years, no one suspected, until Richard Abernethy made his discovery. The silence was absolute now. Faces showed shock, confusion, calculation. Richard realized that one of the people he believed to be a legitimate member of his family was, in fact, illegitimate, with no legal right to inherit. And more than that, he realized this person had been deceiving the family for years. He changed his will, planning to expose the deception. But before he could do so, he was murdered. Murdered how? Gregory Banks asked, his voice hoarse. By a clever and ruthless method. Poison, but not a poison that would be easily detected. You see, Richard Abernethy took digitalis for his heart condition. The murderer knew this, and the murderer knew that an overdose of digitalis would cause heart failure that would appear entirely natural, especially in an elderly man with a weak heart. But who had access to his medication? Hastings asked, playing his part in the revelation. That is the clever part. Anyone in the household could have accessed his medication. It was kept in his bathroom cupboard, readily available. But the actual administration required someone who could give Richard his evening bicarbonate of soda. Someone he trusted implicitly. All eyes turned to Helen. "No!" Helen cried. "I gave him his bicarbonate, yes, but I didn't poison it. I loved Richard." "I did not say you poisoned it, madam," Poirot said gently. "But someone did. Someone who had access to the kitchen, to Richard's medication, and to the bicarbonate preparation. Someone who knew that Richard was planning to expose them." He turned to face the table squarely. "And then there is Cora. Foolish, tactless Cora, who announced at the funeral that Richard had been murdered. Why did she say this? Because Richard had confided something to her during her visit. Not the full details, but enough to make her suspicious. And after she returned home, she remembered something else. Something she had seen, something that confirmed Richard's suspicions. Poirot produced the painting. This, her painting of Enderby Hall. She painted 4 windows on the second floor when there should only be 3. This 4th window was the window of the hidden room. She had seen it from the garden during her visit, and when she began to think about what Richard had told her, she realized the significance of that hidden room. She wrote to Mr. Entwistle, intending to share her revelation. But before she could mail the letter, the murderer came to her cottage and killed her. "This is all very dramatic," Timothy said shakily, "but you still haven't told us who the murderer is." "Have I not?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Let me continue then. The murderer had to be someone who could travel to Berkshire on short notice. Someone who knew Cora had remembered something dangerous. Someone who knew where she lived and that she lived alone. Someone who had everything to lose if the truth came out." He paused, and in that pause, the truth seemed to crystallize in the air. The illegitimate daughter of Leo Abernethy and Evelyn Garth was adopted by a couple named Jonathan and Margaret Banks. They renamed her Susan. Susan Banks, as she grew up knowing she was adopted. In her 20s, she discovered her true parentage, and she determined to claim her rightful place in the Abernethy family. Susan Banks rose to her feet, her face white with fury. "That's a lie. I'm not—" "Please, madame, sit down. I have the documents to prove it. The adoption certificate with your original name, Evelyn Mary Garth. The birth certificate listing Leo Abernethy as your father. The letters Evelyn wrote to Leo. All of it hidden in that secret room. All of it found by Richard Abernethy." "But Susan inherits under the will," George protested. "Why would Richard leave her money if he knew she was illegitimate?" But you forget, monsieur. Richard changed his will only 2 weeks before his death. The will that was read was the one he wrote after discovering the truth. And if you examine it carefully, you will see that Susan's bequest is described as going to Susan Banks, daughter of my late brother Leo. But legally, an illegitimate child has no claim as a child of the family. Richard was leaving the money to Susan as an act of charity, acknowledging the blood relationship while ensuring she knew he had discovered her deception. He was planning to reveal the truth after the will was read, to explain why he had structured it as he did. Susan's face was a mask of rage and despair. He would have ruined me, taken everything from me. I had a right to that money. Leo was my father. But you had deceived the family for years. You presented yourself as the legitimate daughter of Jonathan and Margaret Banks, distant cousins of the Abernethys. You cultivated the family connection. You married Gregory, whose own legitimacy gave you added credibility. And you waited for the inheritance that you believed was rightfully yours. And when Richard discovered the truth, you killed him. You knew he took digitalis. You knew his routine. You extracted digitalis from his own medication, dissolved it in his evening bicarbonate, and gave it to him in a dose carefully calculated to cause heart failure. With your medical training as a nurse, you knew exactly what dose would be fatal but would appear natural. You can't prove any of this. On the contrary, madam, the evidence is quite clear. The documents in the hidden room prove your true parentage. Your adoption records confirm it. And as for the murder, digitalis poisoning leaves certain traces in the body. I have arranged for Richard Abernethy's body to be exhumed and examined by a toxicologist. I am confident they will find elevated levels of digitalis consistent with fatal poisoning. Susan's composure shattered. He was going to take everything from me. Everything I'd worked for, everything I deserved. I am Leo's daughter. His blood runs in my veins. But not his legitimacy, madame. And you knew that if the truth came out, you would lose not only the inheritance, but your position in society, your husband's respect, everything you had built your life upon. And Cora? Hastings prompted. Cora was collateral damage. She remembered seeing that hidden window. She began to put the pieces together. Susan knew that if Cora shared her suspicions with Mr. Entwistle, or with me, the investigation would intensify. So she drove to Berkshire, ransacked the cottage to make it look like a burglary, and killed Cora before she could reveal what she knew. I didn't want to. Susan's voice was anguished now. But she was going to ruin everything. She and her stupid painting, her stupid memories. I had no choice. There is always a choice, madame, Poirot said quietly. You chose murder. Twice. At that moment, Inspector Raglan and his officers entered from the adjoining room. Raglan approached Susan, his face grave. Susan Banks, I am arresting you for the murders of Richard Abernethy and Cora Lansquenet. You need not say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence against you. Susan seemed to collapse in on herself. She looked at Gregory, whose face showed shock and horror. I did it for us, she whispered. For our future. The money would have been ours. You killed for it, Gregory said, his voice hollow. You're a murderer. As the police led Susan away, the room erupted in shocked conversations. Helen was weeping quietly. Timothy looked ill. George was blustering about family honor. Poirot rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the London street below. The trial was brief and sensational. The evidence against Susan Banks was overwhelming. The documents from the hidden room proved her illegitimate birth. The exhumation of Richard Abernethy's body revealed fatal levels of digitalis in his tissues. Susan's own fingerprints were found on objects in Cora's cottage that she had no legitimate reason to have touched. She was convicted of both murders and sentenced to death by hanging, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Gregory Banks divorced her immediately after the trial. He left England, returning to his native Scotland, and was never heard from again in Abernethy circles. The estate was redistributed according to Richard's final wishes, with Susan's portion being divided among the other beneficiaries. Helen Abernethy used her inheritance to establish a foundation for adoption support services. Timothy and Maud retired to the south of France, where Timothy's mysterious ailments seemed to improve remarkably. George Crossfield continued to manage investments, though with greater caution and oversight. Enderby Hall was sold to a wealthy industrialist who restored it lovingly, unaware of the tragedies that had occurred within its walls. 3 months after the trial, Poirot and Hastings sat in Poirot's London apartment, enjoying a peaceful evening. The fire burned cheerfully in the grate, and Poirot was methodically arranging his collection of ceramic objects on the mantelpiece, ensuring perfect symmetry. "A sad case," Hastings observed, puffing on his pipe. "Susan Banks might have lived her life peacefully if she hadn't been so greedy." "Not greedy, mon ami. Desperate. She had built her entire identity on a lie. She had convinced herself that she deserved the Abernethy fortune because she was Leo's daughter. When that identity was threatened, she lashed out like a cornered animal." Poirot adjusted a small figurine a millimetre to the left. "It is the danger of deception, Hastings. One lie requires another and another, until the structure becomes so fragile that it must be defended at any cost. She might have confessed. Richard might have been merciful, perhaps. But pride, it is a powerful thing. Susan could not bear to be revealed as illegitimate, as an impostor. She preferred murder to humiliation. And poor Cora, killed simply because she had a good eye for architecture and painted what she saw. Such is the price of observation sometimes," Poirot said sadly. "If she had not painted that fourth window, if she had not remembered Richard's words about someone's illegitimacy, she would still be alive, painting her cheerful amateur pictures and feeding her cats." "Do you think anyone else in the family suspected? Perhaps Helen had some idea about Leo's past. Perhaps she chose not to investigate too closely. But I do not think anyone else knew. The secret was well hidden, until Richard's sharp eyes noticed the resemblance between Susan and the photographs of Evelyn Garth." Hastings was silent for a moment, then asked, "How did you know it was Susan? When did you suspect?" Poirot smiled. "Ah, the little grey cells, they had many clues. First, Susan's medical training. She would know about digitalis and its effects. Second, her proximity to Enderby Hall. She could easily have visited the night of Richard's death. Third, her immediate conviction that Richard had been murdered. She knew because she had killed him. And finally, the rosemary. The rosemary? Found in Cora's cottage. Rosemary for remembrance. It is an herb that grows commonly in gardens, but it also has significance in the language of flowers. Loyalty, remembrance, friendship. Susan kept a small herb garden at her cottage. I visited there, you recall, when we were investigating. She had rosemary growing by her door. A sprig must have fallen from her coat when she killed Cora. Such a small thing to betray a murderer. It is always the small things, Hastings. The little details that the guilty overlook in their haste and panic. Susan was clever, but not quite clever enough. She made mistakes. The ransacking of Cora's cottage was too thorough, too deliberate. A true burglar would have grabbed valuables and fled. And the violence of Cora's murder, struck multiple times with a hatchet, that spoke of desperation, of fury, of someone killing to protect a secret, not a stranger killing for gain. Poirot stepped back, examining his arrangement of objects with satisfaction. But it is over now. Justice has been served. The innocent can rest in peace, and the guilty has been punished. Do you think she feels remorse? Perhaps, in the quiet of her cell, away from the pressures of maintaining her deception, she may reflect on what she has done. She may come to understand that no inheritance, no fortune, is worth the price of 2 lives and the destruction of her own soul. Poirot turned from the mantelpiece. "But that is for her conscience to judge. We have done our duty." Hastings rose and stretched. "Well, I don't know about you, Poirot, but I'm ready for a simpler case next time. All this business of illegitimacy and hidden rooms and secret documents, it's exhausting." Poirot chuckled. But where would be the satisfaction in a simple case? It is the complexity, the challenge, that makes the solution worthwhile. The more tangled the web, the greater the triumph when we unravel it. You're incorrigible, but correct, n'est-ce pas? Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Come, let us have some hot chocolate, and perhaps you will read to me from the newspaper. I wish to rest the little grey cells after their exertions." They settled into their chairs before the fire, the evening drawing in around them. Outside, London hummed with its endless life, its countless dramas and tragedies and comedies playing out in the gathering darkness. But here, in this peaceful apartment, order had been restored, mysteries solved, and justice served. Poirot sipped his hot chocolate with satisfaction, his magnificent moustaches pristine, his egg-shaped head tilted back against the cushion. Another case concluded, another murderer brought to justice, another demonstration of the power of the little grey cells and methodical reasoning. And in Berkshire, in a small cottage now shuttered and silent, Cora Lansquenet's amateur paintings gathered dust, including the one of Enderby Hall with its telling fourth window. The window that had revealed a secret and cost 2 lives, but had ultimately led to truth and justice. The funeral was over. The inheritance was settled. The murderer was punished. And Hercule Poirot, the greatest detective in England, perhaps in all of Europe, could rest content that order had been restored to a disordered world, at least for a little while.